This is about the worst job in the droid army. What? And it just went into overtime.
Everyone loves B1 battle droids, and if you don't, you're wrong. In Star Wars The Clone Wars especially, they're pretty endearing for killer robots, known among fans for their tremendous stupidity and numerous funny moments. But if you spend enough time watching clips of the B1's antics, you start to wonder why on earth the Separatists made them so chatty. In the Clone Wars, the battle droids never shut up, and sometimes their antics outright hinder their combat performance. It just doesn't seem fitting for droids mass-produced as cannon fodder to be given such personality. So, what gives? In this video, we'll be answering that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
As most of you surely know, the original B1 battle droids were not capable of independent thought. While their OOM series commanders had a limited capacity for higher function, standard B1s relied on external central control computers to function, typically housed aboard Lucrehulk-class droid control ships in orbit. This was at the behest of the Trade Federation, which commissioned the droids from Bactoid combat automata, and it was partly a cost-cutting move and partly a strategic choice. Obviously, the notoriously stingy Neimoidian leaders of the Trade Federation were looking to save money by not paying for their units to have full droid brains. But beyond that, there was actually pretty decent justification for reliance on a central computer. For one thing, even if the Trade Federation decided to pay for fully independent droids from the get-go, they still would have been less intelligent and especially less creative than organic soldiers. That's because combat droids in particular required extensive programming restrictions to limit the risk of them going rogue, which by necessity inhibited creativity, intuition, and many other things that were essential on the battlefield, but came with the risk of rebellion. You only need to look at HK-47 and his progeny to understand what we mean. When it came to combat droids, you had to choose between intelligence and obedience most of the time. Striking a balance between the two was prohibitively expensive for an army. So the Trade Federation didn't bother with any of that. Instead, they essentially commissioned lobotomized droids that could be collectively micromanaged by a supercomputer. This came with the added benefit of massively improving the droids' coordination. Since first generation B1s were all centrally controlled, they worked together flawlessly, and on the battlefield, they were more coordinated than was physically possible for any non-force sensitive organic army. It was essentially an artificial form of Jedi battle meditation, a rare force technique that allowed individual Jedi to turn the tide of entire battles. Of course, as we all know, the central control model had a pretty major downside. Destroying the central control computer shut down the whole droid army. The Trade Federation learned this the hard way during the Battle of Naboo, and when they began expanding their armies of B1s as part of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, they decided to shift away from the central control model to avoid having a second Naboo fiasco.
Look, it's RB-551. No wonder he got blasted. He's one of those older models programmed by a central computer. Not us. We're independent thinkers. Roger, 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 roger.
During the Separatist crisis, Bactoid revised their designs for the B1 battle droids, giving them proper droid brains alongside their CCC transceivers. These droid brains were as cheap and bare bones as possible, but they nonetheless allowed B1s to operate independently of a central control computer when necessary. Most of the time, the Confederacy still used central control computers to manage their troops and improve coordination. But the retrofit meant that destroying a droid's army control ship wouldn't force the whole army to shut down. Giving the B1s independent thought came with another benefit as well. It allowed the Confederacy to program the B1s for a broader variety of roles. Central control computers mostly relied on algorithms and scanned data from organic armies to program the droids under their command, making it difficult to modify droids for specialized roles. With the advent of independent thought modules, however, the Separatists could just download new skill sets into their B1s when they were set down, making their droids much more versatile. Ever the cheapskates, the Separatist Council took advantage of this newfound versatility to avoid commissioning new droid models for every little task. Instead, they just had their commanders program B1's to accomplish whatever tasks they needed. As such, during the Clone Wars, B1's became pilots, gunners, firefighters, scouts, janitors, and aides, as well as soldiers. The CIS Navy especially abused this capability, making up for a constant shortage of organic crew by manning many of their warships exclusively with retrofitted B1's. This, plus the extensive automation seen aboard some of the Separatists' cheaper warship classes, like the Munificent-class frigate and Recusant-class light destroyer, meant that the CIS Navy could field whole fleets of ships that were essentially disposable. Of course, just because the Separatists could program the B1's to fill new roles didn't mean the droids were any good at them. B1 gunners were notorious for being terrible shots, B1 firefighters were relentlessly incompetent, and B1 pilots couldn't compare to their organic counterparts. Part of the reason for this was because the constant retrofits pushed the B1's to the very limits of their processing power. Their already overtaxed droid brains were completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the information they had to manage, and it hurt the B1's performance not only in their new roles, but across the board. To make matters worse, the Separatists found out early in the war that two key parts of regular droid maintenance, diagnostics and memory defragmentation, had a tendency to erase the B1's specialty programming. Their solution, predictably, was to just skip those steps during maintenance, and that went about as well as you might expect. The lack of proper maintenance intensified the data management problems caused by the droid's specialty program. And this resulted in frequent cases of system corruption, suboptimal performance, and, importantly for us, behavioral anomalies. The chattiness we mentioned at the start of the video was actually B1's attempt to deal with constant data overloads. Like many people do in real life, their reaction to being overwhelmed with more information than they could process was to keep up a running commentary. Presumably, this was especially bad with droids that weren't connected to a central control computer at all, as the centrally managed droids could at least rely on the central computer to remove some of the strain. But when central control wasn't a factor, the poor B1's had to try process everything on their own overtaxed, poorly made logic modules. Related to this, it's unconfirmed but likely that the reason B1's had so much personality for simple combat droids was because of the aforementioned frequent lack of maintenance. As you likely know, it was very common for droids to develop unique personality quirks when they went a long time without a memory wipe, as was notably the case for the astromech droids R2-D2 and T3-M4. Since some of the maintenance that was often neglected for B1's was memory related, it's possible that it might have had a similar effect, thus explaining the droid's personality quirks. That bit's just our theory, but we think the evidence for it is pretty compelling. With all that said, not all of the B1's quirks were the result of poor design or maintenance practices. In some cases, loyalist saboteurs infiltrating droid factories were able to download viruses into thousands of battle droids, making these memory and maintenance problems even worse, and sometimes just implementing odd and counterproductive behavior outright. This sabotage was usually subtle and indistinguishable from other problems that B1's often had, and due to chronic lack of maintenance, these viruses ran rampant in the ranks of the droid army, worsening the battle droid's performance. The problem was made even worse by the fact that most Separatist droid factories were almost entirely automated, so saboteurs could have factories program viruses into every droid they produced, and there was a very low chance of this sabotage ever being discovered. All told, the CIS droid army had a whole lot of problems, and the rank-and-file B1 battle droids often ended up suffering the most because of them. The entertaining quirks many fans know these droids for were actually symptoms of stress and overwork, the ramblings of beings with far more to process than they had the bandwidth for. In other words, B1 battle droids were even more of a mood than we thought they were. Yet again, we can't help but feel sorry for the plight of the B1's. But what do you think? Are there other nagging Clone Wars questions you'd like to see answered? Let us know that and all your other thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.